This session is Imagining Other Utopian Worlds. Speaking first will be, well, I'm not sure who's speaking first, but is it Pita? So it's Beatrice Pita, teaches in Spanish in the Spanish section of the Department of Literature at UC San Diego, with Rosaura Sanchez, the second speaker. She has edited and written the introduction to Ruiz de Bourton's two novels, The Squatter and the Don, and Who Would Have Thought It? Conflicts of Interest, the letters of Maria Amparo Ruiz de Bourton, or Burton, also written in collaboration with Rosaura Sanchez, appeared in 2001. She and Rosaura are the authors of the 2009 sci-fi novel Lunar Braceros, 2125 to 2148. The second speaker is, who I've been mentioning already, Rosaura Sanchez, is professor in the Department of Literature at UC San Diego and a member of the Spanish, Cultural Studies, and English sections of the department. Her work in critical theory, literary analysis, and sociolinguistics, and her fiction have appeared in numerous literary journals and anthologies. She is the author of Chicano Discourse, Telling Identities, the California Testimonios, Conflicts of Interest, and co-editor of Ruiz de Bourton's novels, The Squatter and the Don, and Who Would Have Thought It? She and Beatrice Pita are co-authors of the 2009 sci-fi novel Lunar Braceros, which formerly mentioned. Without any further ado.
Thank you, and we're both pleased, since we're doing this jointly, as it were, we're both pleased to be here to take part in this acknowledgement of Kallenbach and the Kallenbach moment in California. He was indeed a register and a catalyst of 1970s countercultural critique in the US. We're going to talk a bit about speculative fiction, and speculative fiction like that of Kallenbach has a critical and catalytic potential to reimagine the present and therefore transform the future. Like science fiction, it taps in a positive way, productively and creatively, into narrative's mechanisms of willing suspension of disbelief. In doing so, it allows for technical moment here. Is that better? Is that better? In doing so, it allows for critique and reflection by analogy. It does so, among other ways, via distortion, via the refraction of the future onto the past, which is the present. The defamiliarized space in which speculative fiction operates allows for fissures, lacunae, cracks, and as we know from the Leonard Cohen axiom, that's how the light gets in. That is for those of old school. Narrative, a reference that will be lost on many. Narratives marked by this type of cognitive dissonance that are not fantasy but rather speculative fiction, or as Kallenbach termed his, political fiction, are marked by imaginative, inventive potential and offer alternative histories. Some 40 years down the space-time continuum, it is clear that Kallenbach's Ecotopia fulfilled that promise and potential. And yet, in Kallenbach's Ecotopia and Ecotopia Emerging, people of color are glaringly absent from center stage. Moved by the cultural nationalist impetus of the moment, African Americans are said to have self-segregated themselves in the Oakland area, but they do not share, walk, or bike the streets of Ecotopia. The Chinese have their enclave in San Francisco. Native Americans, although absent, are revered for their respect for Earth. The Spanish language appears only once in the novel, but there are no actually existing Latinos in Ecotopia. In the decade of the 70s, the number of people of color in what would be Ecotopia was certainly not as high as it is today. Some 2.4 million Latinos in California, 12% in 1970, and some 15 million, 39% in 2014. Clearly, Kallenbach could not perhaps anticipate that in 2015 Latinos would be the largest ethnic group in California, and that we would, for better or worse, necessarily play a role in sustaining the ecosystem or in furthering its decay and destruction. Kallenbach's Ecotopia stands out for its radical ecologism, for its call for ecological autarky, of self-sufficiency and economic independence, the potential for a radical reorganization and reconceptualization of people's relationship with the earth and with other people. But the people in Ecotopia, for all their heterogeneity and openness, appear decidedly ethnically and racially homogeneous, unhyphenated Americans, forcing us to ask, do utopians dream in color? A similarly intriguing question that we would like to pose to you today is, why is it that currently there are so few examples of what we might collectively term Latino futurisms? In terms of the US, there is curiously an apparent dearth of Latina science fiction writers and filmmakers. The question is, why are there so relatively few Latino and Chicano examples of science fiction authors with stories about artificial intelligence, cyber regimes, cyborgs, robots, clones, spaceships, interplanetary travel, time travel, virtual reality, and multiple domains and avatars? There are exceptions, of course, like Jesus Trevino, who directed and filmed episodes of Babylon 5, Deep Space Nine, and Star Trek episodes, and there is, of course, Alex Rivera's Sleep Dealer, 2009. But by and large, there is not a broad and deep presence of Latino Chicanos in current sci-fi narratives. The little Chicano Latino sci-fi that we do have is in very large measure dystopic. In Rivera's futuristic Sleep Dealer, we see that the Mexican labor is a cyber bracero, providing essential and exploitable mano de obra from afar, from miles away across the border. Our own lunar braceros suggest a dystopic Earth drowning in its own waste that is shipped off to the moon. Latino life is expendable, both below on Earth, where surplus workers are kept on reservations, and likewise on the moon, where the spent lunar braceros, workers, Latinos, blacks, and Asians, are disappeared rather than returned to Earth. Lunar Braceros was our opportunity to play out future sci-fi scenarios of contemporary issues that, from today's vantage point, do not seem to bode well for the future of Latinos and a lot of other people more generally down here on Earth. We decided to shoot the characters and their issues into the stratosphere some 100 years into the future and see what developed. The novel enabled us to deal with bracero exploitation, now on the moon, and now taking the form of technological work rather than with merely manual labor. In the new territory of Cali, Texas, a reformulated nation-state combining the west, north, and south, and parts of west, north, and south of the U.S., and parts of northern and western Mexico, there is also a resurgence of reservations to keep the officially and habitually unemployed or unemployable contained. After uncovering what is truly taking place on the moon missions and rising up against the local moon laboratory control center, the Lunar Braceros return to Earth via Argentina and are initially persecuted but ultimately granted shelter in an indigenous community in Ecuador. In questioning the bleak future suggested by today's late capitalist world, there exist in Lunar Braceros, by contrast, and in some fashion, a utopian indigenous commons that is still trying to survive in the Andes, but it is under severe duress and subject to attack by global corporations keen on taking over natural resources. Once back on Earth, the surviving Lunar Braceros become aware of the need to overthrow the regime in Cali, Texas, now under control of capitalistic Latinos, beginning what will be a long, multiform march against the Cali, Texas regime and globalized powers that be. Neither utopias nor redeemers seem to be in the offing for the Lunar Braceros, only ongoing struggles on variable fronts. One aspect that Sleep Dealer shares in some measure with Lunar Braceros is the need for resistance as well as its focus on labor, and that today much not in vogue concept of exploitation. As noted earlier, given the relative dearth of U.S. Latino sci-fi and the social location of the greater part of U.S. Latinos, we anticipate and we would be especially keen to see instances of science fiction narratives that offer potential for a critique of capitalism, of labor exploitation, and the multiple forms of oppression. Sleep Dealer is notable too for taking on the issue of technological enhancements of humans as a means to their further exploitation in the ever-expanding marketplace of commodities, material or immaterial, like the commodified dreams of Luz in the film narrative. The film Sleep Dealer, like our own Lunar Braceros, cannot idealize the present nor the future. By contrast, much of contemporary Chicano, Chicana, Latino, narratives continue to abound with a focus on the otherworldly, on the supernatural, vampires, werewolves, shamans, brujas, orishas, and babalaos. Surprisingly to us, there is all too little Chicano-Latino science fiction focusing on science, biotechnology, aliens, or planetary travel. On the other hand, notions of retro-utopias are enduring, suggesting worlds wherein indigenous life patterns and more harmonious existence with nature remain as utopian ideals. For example, visions of the restoration of Aztlan or the Incan Tawantinsuyo. Given the impact of historical import of mestizaje in the American continent, one might expect, for example, that sci-fi genres would seem fertile ground for narrative exploration of concerns regarding what we might call new mestizajes, new human-machine-alien hybridizations via interbreeding, as well as biotechnologies of gene selection, implants, enhancement, clones, cyborgs, and replacement parts procured on black markets or fabricated in labs. Yet there is little of that in most current Chicano-Latino fiction. Mainstream film and popular culture seem to be ahead of the curve in taking on these issues and inserting racial and ethnic diversity into these scenarios, like Blade Runner and so many others after it. Though not science fiction in the science fiction form per se, ecological issues, broadly read, do figure in Chicano-Latino fiction. The wholesale degradation of the planet, the disproportionate effect of contamination and differential access to natural resources appear in various forms in Latino Chicano fiction. In the works, for example, of New Mexican writer Rodolfo Anaya, Shaman Winter and Jemez Spring most notably, the Pueblo Indians represent another relationship with the earth. Water rights in the late 20th century in New Mexico are always in danger of being controlled by capitalist interests. The dispossession of native lands is ongoing, and the indigenous people and their descendants are powerfully aware of the risks of nuclear waste produced by nearby labs. Against these menaces, Anaya's characters turn to the spiritual, to the ancient Cachinas of the Anasazi Indians, or to the shamans that practice in their own backyards an ecologically sustainable production-consumption relationship with nature's forces. In Anaya's work, contact with the past is often established through dreams, but that past, too, is full of violence and destruction of native lands and practices. Ecological utopias are suggested as existing before the 16th century, before the arrival of the Spanish, and before the arrival of US soldiers and settlers in the 19th century. Other exceptions of writers who in their work pointedly and poignantly address the ongoing ecocide of the environment and how it affects certain groups more than others are Chicano writers like Moraga in Heroes and Saints and Viramontes Under the Feet of Jesus. Both authors represent the unacceptable ecological and human costs of toxic pesticide use in the fields and the harmful effects on farm workers and their families. As regards non-hegemonic groups specifically, to our mind what is crucial about science fiction and speculative fiction in general is that it allows for a critical perspective on society, and more specifically of capitalism, through a futuristic lens. Yet critical discourses are not inherent to this genre or subgenre, nor is capitalism, its correlates and consequences, requisite targets of speculative fiction, as Le Guin, who has been mentioned before, as Le Guin has noted. Much speculative fiction is more often than not critical of the state and or of political practices, or focuses on scenarios of an ecological apocalypse or the risks posed by technology and dehumanization. Unlike Jameson, who speaks of science fiction as signaling our incapacity to imagine the future, our incapacity for a utopian imagination, Samuel Delany, on the other hand, does not question our capacity to imagine the future. On the contrary, for him, science fiction, quote, isn't just thinking about the world out there. It's also thinking about how the world might be, a particularly important exercise for those who are oppressed. Because if they're going to change the world we live in, they, and all of us, have to be able to think about a world that works differently. End of quote. We have not, unfortunately, found this viable alternative future of which Delany speaks in the literature of US Chicanos and Latinos, and even in the great majority of Latin American science fiction works. Science fiction and speculative fiction genres are flourishing in Latin America in the current moment, although of course they've been around since at least the 19th century. Much of Latin American sci-fi, is highly dystopic too. Not surprisingly, perhaps, in light of the decades of violence, dictatorships, torture, imprisonment, and disappearances, renderings of the future turn out often to be as hard, brutal, and oppressive as the present. Utopian imaginings are hard to come by, even in fiction. We have to bear in mind, too, that speculative fiction narratives are not inherently progressive or anti-hegemonic. In some Chicano-Latino speculative fiction, the historical is mere simulacrum. For example, in Ernest Hogan's Pancho Villa's Flying Circus. And we know that the tokenized or othered presence of minority Latinos in narrative and film is not necessarily always a good thing either. More prevalent in Latin American sci-fi is the use of futuristic cities that provide the background for critique of dictatorship and or life after a nuclear or other type of ecological or climatic holocaust. Ecological issues are often combined with political. In the Mexican writer Fernandez Bravo's stories, Un Día Temido, a war and explosion of a toxic waste transport have contaminated the city's water supply. The city is surrounded by La Zona, an area of slums, makeshift houses, violence, and poverty. While the city turns a blind eye to this precarity, the middle classes thrive till the water supply for them runs out, and people begin fighting over the few remaining drops in their cisterns. Only the wealthy continue to have access to drinkable water. The class structure and the violence it produces become evident as a couple in the story tries to make a run for it out of the city. The day of their escape, even the guards have fled, and the couple's car is stopped in the middle of a zone by the poverty-stricken people dying of thirst. While the wife screams, as the crowd approaches her car, that they are not at fault, the husband acknowledges that he doubts that to be the case. Ecological, political, and economic problems are the basis of this dystopic, futuristic, but not science fiction narrative. There is no specific mention of the war, nor of the state, nor of the ruling economic system, except to suggest that it is very much class-structured. Ecological, here specifically anthropogenic climactic disasters, are at the center, too, of Fase Domingo by Mexican writer Armenta Camacho. This story combines a futuristic setting with scenes from the Cold War era. Narrated in two parts, the story first introduces two old people from a small farm in Durango trying to survive a drought. The narrative then goes on to play out the catastrophic climatic shifts from a nuclear event between 20th century superpowers that results in that Durango, in Mexico, is now a temperate border zone with no dearth of water at the edge of a new depopulated Ice Age region to the north. Those are two examples that I wanted to give to you. And to sort of wrap it up, in bleak times such as these, the creation of utopias, of fictional spaces of alterity, the ability to think outside the box is certainly something not to be disparaged or dismissed. In some very important ways, we would hope that science fiction or speculative fiction would offer a way out and work against the closure of the current historical moment of this very, very late capitalist world of cynicism and complacency, the world in which there is no alternative. There is no alternative. You will be assimilated, comply, and consume. We are in dire need of an antidote or corrective, and yes, of utopias that offer some glimmer or glimpse of alternate outcomes from those that seem to be in store. What is evident in both Latino and Latin American science fiction generally is that the genre is characterized by defamiliarizing lenses, with an eye to carrying out critiques of contemporary issues. Beyond lamenting the disasters, ecological, social, individual, collective, few, if any, utopias per se are envisioned. The prevailing outlook is predominantly dystopian, and the focus is, as a rule, centered on the individual or small collectivities. Large-scale collective actions or revolutionary scenarios are not generally depicted nor envisioned, not yet in any event. The utopian impulse of embracing hypotheticals, what-ifs, of exploring what seems impossible in the present but plausible or possible in the future is not yet realized. And yet there is, undeniably, in much of speculative fiction, whether sci-fi or not, a not even if fulfilled underlying utopian impulse, despite its often dystopic depiction of the future. Sci-fi speaks with more clarity and more relevance to crucial, unresolved, and long-standing issues than a good bit of presentist, individual-centered, self-consuming artifacts characteristic of much of postmodern cultural production. These speculative genres are, to our mind, clearly areas with potential and possibilities that U.S. Chicanos and Latinos need to consider as venues to further tap, because at present, much of our literature is still heavily centered on paradigms of realistic representation and on issues of identity, sexuality, family, and assimilation, often within a national narrative. These approaches to representation are in some measure increasingly played out tropes that are proving to be all too absorbable by dominant ideologies and contemporary publishing mechanisms, in that they add color and flavor, but not necessarily imaginative critique. We would like to argue that it is perhaps time to broaden the literary repertoire of Chicano-Latino narrative and move away from the familiar, in both sense of the term, and unleash the imaginative, inventive, and critical potential of sci-fi within U.S. Latino fiction. Thank you.
I too thank you for the invitation. As previously noted in Beatrice's presentation, Kallenbach's works, both Ecotopia and Ecotopia Emerging, create a quasi-utopian, mostly white society, a new nation-state that allows for the establishment of separate Black and Chinese city-states within Ecotopia, and that is considering plans for formalizing Spanish-speaking and Japanese communities of San Francisco as city-states within Ecotopia as well. Measures that will ensure the predominantly white composition of most of Ecotopia. Latinos, as Beatrice mentioned, are nowhere to be seen, and even though we were fewer in the 70s, we were still there picking grapes, fruits, and vegetables from the Salinas Valley to the San Joaquin Valley and north into wine country and Sacramento. It was this population of farm workers that Chavez set out to organize, but they seem to have evacuated the scene in Ecotopia, as have the farm workers in the Yakima Valley in the state of Washington. Ecotopia prefers small, self-sustained, culturally homogeneous groupings. This points to a highly racialized society, and perhaps explains why Ecotopia is a closed society with guarded borders and no immigrants clamoring to get in. It is exclusionary, but in its 20 or so years of existence, it has managed to incorporate a good many measures that will eliminate chemical pollution and contamination of the soil, air, and water, and produce a reduction in carbon emissions by doing away with cars. It has succeeded admirably in producing biodegradable plastics, instituting corporate taxes, and recycling paper, plastic, and glass products, and especially sewage. People walk or ride bikes, buses, or trains. Processed and packaged foods are no longer produced, and there is now a reduction in agricultural produce for a smaller population. Sodas are no longer produced, and only materials that decompose are allowed in production. No synthetic clothing is produced. Some industries have been taken over by employees. Some are owned by the state, but clearly there are individual owners as well. Overall, the work schedule has been reduced to 20 hours a week. Monopolies have been eliminated by not allowing any one owner to operate more than one company. There is gender equality, and women are not independent roles. They exercise power in relationships and at work. So it is said. Clearly, there has been a radical reorganization of society, and the population in Ecotopia, which is declining after 20 years, is still led by Vera Alwyn. Ecotopia, like the Green Movement, has an ethical orientation. It proposes the need for an ecocentric worldview to protect the earth and its species. Citizens have been largely convinced of the greater good, Absent is a serious ecological and social critique of capitalism as a world system. While some of the transformations would fit within a socialist society, there are numerous lacunae in the Ecotopian dream that make us wonder where workers who are not part owners fit in. Has exploitation been eliminated? Is all the labor being done by the white citizens of Ecotopia? What is the relation between class and color in Ecotopia? What about wages? Are there any unions? Have they been able to clean up the rivers, beaches, soils in 20 years? We know there is an internal opposition. Those within Ecotopia who wish to return to things as they were, who seek military support from the U.S. and foresee an armed conflict as a result of what they consider this ecological craziness. But is that the only opposition? True, the West and Northwest were highly industrialized, unlike Cuba, for example, but how was acceptance gained from those who previously profited from their private enterprises? What happened to the homeless, the poor, the dispossessed? Did the bosses all pick up and leave, or were they convinced by the best practices policies of Ecotopia? I find it hard to believe that maybe that's... It is only in the epistle to the Ecotopians that Kallenbach wrote, dated 2012, written right before he passed away, that Kallenbach specifically draws upon Marx to remind us that capital has no country. And he adds, quote, "We live then in a dark time here on our tiny, precious planet. Ecological devastation, political and economic collapse, irreconcilable ideological and religious conflict, poverty, famine, the end of the overshoot of cheap oil-based consumer capitalist expansionism," end of quote. Here then, the connections are addressed in a nutshell, the nutshell missing from the rest of the works. Ecological critique is very much a part of contemporary Marxist thought. Ecological Marxists today recognize that the planetary ecological crisis has to be seen in relation to the current capitalist economy. John Bellamy Foster, for example, makes clear that the present greatest acceleration in the deterioration of the planet's ecosystem must be seen in direct and complex relation to the rise of monopoly capitalism and globalization. As argued by Monthly Review, quote, "There has so far been little recognition that monopoly, finance capitalism, and the third technological revolution have produced unique forms of ecological destruction in the past half century," end of quote. If Kallenbach's works on Ecotopia neglect to spell out the specific relation between planetary ecology and capitalism, they do mention in passing that the U.S. is involved in imperialist wars and actions in the global South, in Brazil more specifically, and also in the Middle East. These references allude to the numerous U.S. military adventures that took place in the decade of the 70s when Ecotopia first appeared. Not only was the U.S. finishing up the Vietnam War, but it was also fomenting and facilitating the military coup against President Allende in Chile. It also assisted the military juntas of Argentina during the Dirty War, organized the Contra War against the Sandinistas, assisted Guatemalan military in its war of genocide against the indigenous people of Guatemala, and supported the government of El Salvador in its war against its own peasants, workers, and even the progressive clergy. Of course, the U.S. embargo of Cuba continued. Here, we are only recalling U.S. military action in Latin America, but of course, a few years later, in Afghanistan, the U.S. was supporting bin Laden against the Russians and Hussein against Iran. In the Middle East, the U.S. was also supporting Israel against the dispossessed Palestinians and in its occupation of Palestinian lands. U.S. interests made their presence known in Africa as well. In the process, the U.S. has always found it useful to other those it seeks to subjugate. The U.S., as we all know, has even today numerous military bases, some 761 in fact, throughout the world, and presently is more of a military than an economic power, as argued by Harvey, Kalinikos, and Arrighi, among others. Imperialism, however, is more than military intervention, and as we also know, the U.S. has its finger in many economic pots, supporting transnational corporations that are polluting the soil and depriving natives of water rights. The ecology of the planet requires that we consider the impact of global imperialism, not only in Latin America, but throughout the world. One good example of U.S. imperialism is related to water rights, as noted by the Vice President of the World Bank in 1995. Water, not oil, is the resource over which wars of this century will likely be fought. Shiva, in her work, Privatization, Pollution, and Profit, makes clear that water wars are already a reality and not a thing of the future. One of the best-known water wars is that fought in Cochabamba, Bolivia, in the year 2000, a war that is the background of two films, the James Bond film, Quantum of Solace, that you may have seen, and the Spanish film, También la lluvia, even the rain. In Bolivia, the World Bank and the International Development Bank instituted a new economic policy as part of a neoliberal plan to deal with the rising Bolivian debt of over $4 billion. The plan called for austerity measures and the privatization of public services, including in 1999, Cochabamba's municipal water supply. The privatization of the water was, of course, supported by the Bolivian government of Hugo Banzer, and in this way, Aguas del Tunari, a multinational consortium controlled primarily by the US-based Bechtel Corporation, took control of the water, raising water prices and depriving Bolivians of their water rights, even the rainwater. In Cochabamba, the population rose up in protest, and after many months, including the imposition of martial law and the jailing of labor and protest leaders, the people, 100,000 strong, filled the streets until the government yielded and the water returned to municipal company hands. Closer to home, we're constantly reading of the pollution and contamination of the water supply along the Mexican border, where the maquilas, the assembly plants, U.S. plants, pour out their toxic substances into our arroyos, streets, and creeks. Oil companies are also contaminating the grounds and water supplies in Ecuador, and fracking for oil and gas in the U.S. is also contaminating the water supplies, the air, public health, and driving up global warming. Corporations specifically and human beings in general have become the culprits in this destruction of the planet's ecological system. Environmental historians today suggest that, quote, the Earth is in its 6th great extinction event, with rates of species loss growing rapidly for both terrestrial and marine ecosystems, end of quote. Humans now This change in the world's ecosystems marks what is being called the beginning of a new geological epoch or age, the Anthropocene epoch that follows the Holocene epoch that came with the last ice age and the beginning of a relatively warm climate. All human history since before the invention of agriculture is said to have occurred during the Holocene. But now ecological change is being driven by the active interference of humans. And for that reason, ours is being called the Anthropocene epoch, or as some suggest, another age within the Holocene. But it does not augur well for us long-term as a species. We humans collectively are thus largely responsible for the planetary emergency represented by global warming, the melting of the ice in the Arctic, the rising sea levels, the rising carbon emissions, the ocean acidification, the loss of biological diversity, the collapse of the nation's honeybee colonies, the disappearance of fresh water, the deforestation, and the growing pollution, to name a few. The problem is clearly worldwide and cannot be contained by the actions of one nation state. It's bigger than that. It may already be too late. If this is the reality of our planet, it is difficult to dream about a better world. It is no wonder then, perhaps, that our Latino, Chicano, and Latin American fiction presents for the most part a dystopic view that provides post-apocalyptic scenes in which all is destroyed, water is poisoned, and the earth scorched. And yet, the world is calling for a revolutionary ecological view linked to social transformation. Without it, we do not see a way out. One has to recognize that new imaginings are necessary if we are to forestall a species and planet apocalypse and change the economic and political system. We have to imagine ways to divest ourselves of economic structures that hold us back and that will allow us to transform human relations with nature. That is what is at stake, and Kallenbach saw that. Thank you.
We can subtitle this session, Trouble in Ecotopia. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce my friend Miram Greenberg, who's Associate Professor of Sociology at UCSC. Her research interests are related to and at the intersections of critical urban studies, cultural studies, and the study of place, space, and the environment. She holds a PhD in sociology from the City University of New York Graduate Center and is the author of Crisis Cities, Disaster and Redevelopment in New York and New Orleans, Oxford 2014. Since 2013, she has been directing Critical Sustainabilities, an interdisciplinary web-based research project exploring competing discourses of sustainability in California. The impact of Ecotopia and the 1970s era in which it was written on sustainable imaginaries in our modern California region is one of the inspirations for this project.
Thank you, Dan. And let me see if I can understand how to get my thing going here. There we go. And okay. So I also wanted to thank Ronnie for coordinating the conference together with Joe Chamberlain, all of you for being here. And Dan mentioned the Critical Sustainabilities Project and the many participants in that project with whom I've been thinking about these issues over the last couple of years, and it's been one of the most inspiring academic experiences of my career, and I am still figuring it out. So some of what I'm going to be talking about is a lot of not speculative fiction, speculative nonfiction, based on my experience with that group. And I start with this image, which Ronnie was inspired by for the poster of the conference by R. Crumb. It's actually from the back side of the 20th edition of the Whole Earth Catalog, a compilation of people reflecting 20 years hence after the creation of the Whole Earth Catalog on not kind of where we go from here, and where have we come. And a reflection, I think, by R. Crumb on the imagined apocalyptic dystopian future that awaited the world in the 1970s in a moment of crisis globally and in California and other parts of the US, but also other parts of the world. One that was often imagined as a dystopia caused by overconsumption, by runaway forms of urbanization that was destroying the environment. And on the other hand, I think we see two color tableaus, both the one used for the conference and this high-tech future in the center, which I think is interesting, those two possible future escapes from dystopia. And I think about that also because of the present day. I'm going to turn here to an image. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this image by any chance. I'm just curious because it's been circulated a lot in the media, and I don't see any hands up in this particular audience, but it's an image of a future Googleplex in Mountain View that has won numerous awards around the world, as has the current Googleplex. But the imagined future of Googleplex is already winning awards, as have other of the major tech campuses in Silicon Valley, like the Apple II spaceship building people may have seen, and which is this kind of circular donut-shaped building plopped down in the middle of the woods without any seeming need for access by cars and housing for its workers. And in addition, the Facebook building in Palo Alto and other tech campuses are really invested in this notion of what Google calls Google Green, and other companies have branded in their own way, but the idea that they're living out a future that was dreamed of by Ecotopia, as well as by Stuart Brand and many of the participants in the Whole Earth Catalog. And you see here in the top image, the outside view of the tech campus and an interior view of people. I don't know if you can tell, but there's an interior running track and yoga going on right next door. And then workers are, it's kind of also I think inspired by a building that's analyzed on our site by Simon Sadler called the Bateson Building, which was one of the first ecological state office buildings in Sacramento that had this kind of open architecture that allowed people to have natural light, free circulating air, and more opportunities for interaction and socialization. That was a kind of public state building, and here privatized under this giant dome. So the question really comes for me, kind of how do we go from that to that? Is a big question motivating our project. How did we get to where we are today? So how did we get from, and I'm going to talk more about sort of what's contained in, and I think Rosaura and Beatrice have spoken quite a bit about what's contained in the imaginary of Ecotopia and others at this conference. I'm going to return to that and also think about how it was something that was either ignored in the creation of the Googleplex campus, and or the Googleplex campus was a working out of the kind of contradictions inherent within the Ecotopian imaginary of the 70s, and or that there's some kind of selective embrace, that there's something fueling the current green tech imaginary in our region that is indebted to that book, but also only partially, and that's something I want to explore. So, and in terms of the first point about, and I'm thinking about Andrew Matthews' point about narratives. In a way, this is a different ways of telling a story about what happened. How did we get from A to B? This kind of declensionist Paradise Lost idea is one that presumes that there is this kind of abandonment of all of the original value-oriented principles of the 60s, 70s ecologically oriented worldview. And on the other hand, and I think that that's, given the kind of luxury ecology of this lower tableau, and given the fact that there are enormous ecological consequences, which I'll be talking about, of the kind of rapid pace of market-oriented urban development in our region and sprawl that this campus is also associated with, the ecological consequences of that are not grappled with, and there's an argument that could be made that there's a kind of full abandonment. I think, on the other hand, that it's interesting to think about these 2 points. One, the issue of internal contradictions of the text and of the 1970s more generally, and on the other hand, this issue of the selective embrace. So in terms of the first, ideas of Ecotopia and the larger pantheon of Ecotopian literature of the age, which included Whole Earth Catalog, Richard Register's Eco-City, Sim van der Rijn's eco-oriented design manuals, and many other very influential texts, to the degree that those, or any literature has an effect on urban development, it could be argued that there were some internal contradictions, which Rosaura and Beatrice were referring to. And that is the whole issue of the exclusions that were very present in the text, and arguably present also in the Whole Earth Catalog movement and other movements of the time. And that many scholars of utopia, such as David Harvey, argue are endemic to utopian imaginaries, certain forms of exclusion that we can trace back to utopian narratives from Thomas More's Utopia on, the idea that it's on this island and that it has to be bounded and who's inside and who's outside and so forth. And I think it's really significant, the points that were just raised, that also the kind of post-political or apolitical or post-political dimensions of this, that there's no conflict associated with these utopian futuristic fantasies. It's not only the case that African Americans are segregated in what's called Soul City in the East Bay of San Francisco, where they're allowed to continue to drive cars and drink malt liquor and other things which are not to be found in the rest of Ecotopia. It's that they self-segregate. They choose to segregate. This is what they want. Similarly for the enclaves, the Chinese enclaves and the Japanese enclaves, not so much necessarily for the completely non-existent Latino enclaves, but nonetheless the idea that there was no discussion, there was no argument. It was something that was opted for willingly and happily. In a way, the kind of limits of Kallenbach's imagination or ability to conceive of how the kind of contentious politics that the creation of a utopia might involve might have played out in this world. And I think it's significant in the intro to the new edition that Malcolm Margolin has, the 40th anniversary edition from 2012, Ernest Kallenbach reflects on some of these absences and on some of these limitations, and I think that's significant as well. But nonetheless, these contradictions, these fundamental flaws in the text could be argued to have undermined this original utopian imaginary such that it wasn't able to carry through past, the mid-70s and to stand in the way of this completely market-oriented ecological imaginary of Silicon Valley. So that's certainly, there is certainly some truth in this, though I think also that the current disjunctive reality that we're presented with in looking at these two images of our region represents not simply the working out of inherent contradictions, but also a kind of loss or erasure of key parts of the text, or a selective embrace of the text. Ecotopia was, for all its deeply disturbing identity politics and absences and blind spots and limitations, quite radical in many of its eco-socialist ideals, though clearly not conceived of globally, not conceived of in terms of the kind of world capitalist system, but in terms of the long tradition of utopian socialism going back to, French ideas of the 19th century and some early forms of Marx, a notion of a classless society in which work was shared, property collectively owned, housing, food, and childcare was free. People worked only so much as was needed for the collective, after which time they emphasized leisure, socializing, and various forms of physical pleasure, physical and intellectual and emotional pleasure, as imagined by Kallenbach in his own particular way, with his own particular fantasies at work there. It was a utopia, perhaps of the German ideology, inhabited by people who were fishermen in the morning, farmers in the afternoon, and social critics after dinner. It was a utopia of the 8-hour movement. So the lower image here of Googleplex not only necessarily is about this issue of working out of the internal contradictions, but speaks to the de-radicalization of the text. A very partial embrace of certain elements of Ecotopia that were compatible with emerging late 70s capitalism, itself working its way through this crisis, and essential to that's working its way through crisis in the 70s, namely the green tech side, and the implicit or explicit rejection of those elements of the text that were not compatible. So they kept the bike paths and the recycling bins in spades, but they left out universal childcare, collective ownership of the means of production, and the 8-hour day. So, which is an understatement if you know how tech workers in Silicon Valley, how many hours they're actually working. And this is something I've been informed of by Kristen and other students of mine who have some experience with that industry. The fact that there are nap rooms and in some of the earlier images, actually, there's that I've seen of the new Googleplex campuses, much more luxurious nap rooms for workers who spend their entire lives often, within the space of, completion of a project on the campus and or on buses that are shuttling them from various parts of the Bay Area, working and often going to parties that are with their fellow workers and bosses in the early morning hours before work, which is something that I've yet to wrap my head around. So a very far cry from the kind of imagined, time and space of Ecotopia in that regard. So there's that point. And then I would just like to say that outside of the frame of both of these images, and emphasized by my fellow panelists, are the kinds of utopian imaginaries that were not present in Ecotopia and are still not present today, but that were very present and prevalent in the Bay Area and elsewhere in the 60s and 70s. And so alternative visions of sustainable utopias that circulated then and that continue to circulate, and I'm going to be speaking more about that. And in thinking about that, some full disclosure, and I don't usually incorporate my own biography, but I feel compelled to mention that this brainstorming is coming from someone who grew up in the Bay Area in the 1970s. I was trying to calculate where my birthday fell in relation to Earth Day in 1970. I was born in 1970 in Palo Alto, and saw the slow progression of this reality to that reality. I was happy to hear Fred McPherson talk about Palo Alto in the 60s and early 70s, which people would be shocked by to imagine today, but was the kind of Palo Alto that the tail end of which I was growing up in Pacific High School was mentioned, and also in my teens and early 20s, I was working to some degree. Often I would frequent or work in organizations that were associated, I think, with this Kallenbachian Ecotopian imaginary, like the Common Ground Collective on El Camino, going to Whole Foods Market on California, which was thought to be the first organic grocery store, boasted making the first smoothies in the United States. I don't know if that's true. And also in summers coming home from college, working in East Palo Alto with an organization called the East Palo Alto Historical and Agricultural Society, which enabled me to learn about the long history of utopian dreaming that had gone on in our region and in East Palo Alto, which it was then and remains the largest majority African-American city in the Bay Area, and which was originally created, East Palo Alto, by in the 1920s by a utopian chicken farmer named Charles Weeks, who created Weeksville commune, which was an agricultural commune in which houses were built around the outsides of blocks, and the interior of the block were farms, which had chicken coops, as well as open space for farming. And the people who lived on the exterior of the blocks had spaces in order for animals to pass through their homes, and the idea was 1 acre in Independence, that you could have 1 acre of land behind your house, you could have these chicken coops, and you could be self-sufficient. And it was part of this, very powerful kind of liberal ethos of the 1920s of people kind of picking up, many people, migrants from Dust Bowl and other parts of the country who had agricultural experience and would come here. It was entirely white, and farm this land. Ultimately, it was unincorporated land, it was cheap land. He was able to build this collective, and ultimately it was abandoned in large parts, and or there was this transition as a result of, and I'm not going to get into too much detail on this, but as a result of block busting and redlining, and the racial segregation that happened in the housing market in the Bay Area, and inhabited by African Americans, many of whom had agricultural experience from the South, and reclaimed this history, in addition to creating a kind of Afrocentric utopian vision called Nairobi, renaming East Palo Alto Nairobi, and reclaiming the agricultural practices of their past and beginning to farm once again the interiors of these blocks. Anyway, so the East Palo Alto Historical and Agricultural Society was all about teaching people about this unknown history to most people in the Bay Area, and most people in Palo Alto, most people in the Bay Area, of the region, and to teach young people in East Palo Alto how to farm and all these kinds of techniques as well. So the disjuncture for me often in reading this text is the absence of those realities, and they weren't only in East Palo Alto. In talking about Oakland as this kind of concrete jungle, what's missing is the fact that it's also the birthplace for this region of the environmental justice movement, which was very tied to what was going on in East Palo Alto, the Center for Race, Poverty, and the Environment, Carl Anthony's work in Oakland, is completely elided. And so, there's also this question of how do we look beyond the frame? And I also, in full disclosure mode, teach this text in my Ecometropolis class and often have to kind of grapple with students at UC Santa Cruz who are from this region, many of them, and for who don't have who grew up in the 90s and in which this became the dominant reality and don't have that kind of earlier memory. And I think that many of us are left with this question: what on earth happened? A, and B, with what effects? What has been the effect of this shift? This kind of ideological shift around the role of nature and of development in our region. And what other possibilities are overshadowed insofar as this kind of vision, the Silicon Valley-oriented vision, has become dominant. So I'm going to turn here to just these two different covers from Ecotopia, one showing the whole region, the breakaway, sometimes called Cascadia region, and the other, its capital, generally thought to be San Francisco. So I first wanted to engage with the celebratory aspect of this conference, which I think is terrific, and maybe I don't even need to say it at this point with this audience. I think that we all perhaps recognize how easy it is to dismiss these days utopian dreaming as naive, but it's actually a really vital and extremely powerful thing, and I want to think about some of the power of this text also in our daily lives, in our imaginaries, and its material effects. So utopian thinking gives us the potential to see beyond what's understood to be the contemporary common sense, as Gramsci might say, and to envision an experiment with alternative, better worlds, to capture the feeling, as Kim Stanley Robinson said last night, that anything is possible, and of course that is a feeling that we can embody. Throughout human history, we've had these utopian dreams of Eden, of nirvana, of hope. In imagining these worlds, it means you get to critique, of course, as Jameson reminds us, the status quo, to play with ideas of radically different social relations, and where ecotopian dreaming is concerned, of radically different relations between human and non-human nature. All of this, of course, can be extremely fun. Utopian dreaming is fantasy play, child's play, takes seriously the prefigurative idea that in order to change the world, that world must first be viscerally imagined, felt, experienced, played with. And as with child's play, it is also very serious. It has the potential to be productive of new kinds of knowledge, new kinds of social practice, and new forms of power with all kinds of material effects. So at the meta level of this conference, of course, 40th anniversary of Ecotopia, 50th anniversary of this campus, we would not be here today or in the UC at all had it not been for this kind of utopian dreaming. I also want to think about, we would not be thinking about many of the things we take for granted now around ecological living and ecological urban living had it not been for the work of Ecotopia. So this is an image from that architect Craig Hodgetts created, a rendering in 1978 for a never completed film version of Ecotopia. Someone mentioned how this text had never made its way into a film, which might be an interesting thing to attempt, but maybe it's too banal. Maybe that was the issue. But I think what's significant is the particular kind of utopianism that Northern California represented in the text and for so many other similar kinds of texts in speculative fiction as well as nonfiction, and the kind of what Northern California provided for so many of the seekers that streamed here from around the country and the world to create this kind of ecotopian lifestyle. And we can certainly, I've benefited and I highly recommend for those of you on this campus going into the McHenry Library and seeing the large collection we have of utopian themed books on intentional communities, alternative communities, one of which Fred McPherson mentioned in the Santa Cruz Mountains, in our archives as well. So California has long represented this, as have other parts of the country, of course, and the world that have become kind of historic, kind of major symbolic centers for utopian seekers, like Charles Weeks in the 1920s, that were of all different stripes, religious intentional communities, including, as many mentioned, Zen intentional communities, socialist intentional communities, more agriculturally oriented and pull yourself up by your bootstraps kinds of intentional communities like Weeksville, a whole array of them. In the 1960s, I think the dominant form of intentional community that arrived in California had to do with this counterculture environmental movement that Andrew Kirk, in his great book, Counterculture Green, discusses as having a particularly California and Northern Californian flavor that has had an enormous impact beyond our region. And this is a kind of green, this counterculture green, that, picking up on the point that Ben Wergaft made, that kind of combines the organic and the artifactual. In the text of Ecotopia, we often see this conjoining of archaic and high-tech, the beanbags on the trains, and the wood paneling and the joints alongside of, the bullet train, the effortless speed and the linking of San Francisco here to the Sierras. Imagine high-speed trains linking us to the Sierras since we no longer need highways because we have no cars. And similarly here we see in Hodgett's rendering, these are these energy generators that are in air balloons that are elevated above the bay, and remind us also about the presence of the bay and the Save the Bay movement, and the interest in energy generation, in recycling, of course, and in transportation, that all of which involved the kind of combining of this love for nature and an embrace of technology. So unlike the mainstream American environmentalist movement of the time, which was often very anti-modernist, very anti-technology, very anti-urban, the imaginary of Ernest Callenbach in Ecotopia is an urban imaginary. It's an urban environmental imaginary. The whole split that we know of in terms of the machine in the garden and the idea that this technology is going to have this inevitably corrupting effect does not come to pass in Ecotopia. Rather, there's this notion of what was called appropriate technology that could be harnessed, needed to be harnessed through human ingenuity in order to create the possibility for the elimination of scarcity and this kind of holistic and symbiotic living with nature. So there were all kinds of ideas of alternative technology, of bioregionalism that the Planet Drum Foundation advanced also in this period, and I think that Ecotopia is drawing on, of green design, ecological design, in all realms of design, the idea that it could be something from the most mundane aspects of our lives to the most complex infrastructures. The idea of transit-oriented development, and that you build around transit rather than the other way around, that have had enormous influence and were far ahead of the game in terms of urban environmental thinking, thinking around urban sustainability, planning and policy around urban sustainability. And so something to kind of recognize the significant impact of that imaginary in our capacity to really challenge standard ways of understanding these binaries between humans and nature and an understanding of their interrelations in an urban setting. At the same time, of course, while San Francisco and the Bay Area is lauded, is seen as a mecca, becomes a space like the Bateson Building, like many of the infrastructures that came to pass inspired by Kallenbach, like the Save the Bay movement, San Francisco in this region, Santa Cruz, Davis, become places where people around the world travel in order to learn best practices and take them back to the Middle East, take them back to Latin America and so forth. And this is one of the other inspirations for this project. I'm talking with Julie Z, a colleague at Davis, who was hosting a group of French planners who had come to Davis to study the ecological design of their new dorm buildings. So while this region has become a mecca for all of this and has exported this imaginary through all the films that Christian described, at the same time, we're confronted with this powerful contradiction that it is also one of the most expensive places in the world to live. It is also one of the most exclusive and exclusionary places to live, and unaffordable in terms of the disparity between average income and average housing price. So we also see a situation, and here are the famous Google bus protests of the last year, this is a year and a half ago now, that San Francisco, the capital of Ecotopia, is ranked number one on many sustainability indicator lists at the same time that is number one most unaffordable metropolis in the United States. And Santa Cruz is in hot pursuit of this title for smaller cities. Santa Cruz is considered the 5th most unaffordable city in the country to live in. Santa Cruz has the highest per capita homelessness rate of any city of its size in the country. So we're seeing this disjuncture. Waves of people who are being priced out, evicted, displaced from Ecotopia. With them, we're seeing the displacement of alternative visions of sustainability, of social sustainability alongside of ecological sustainability. And also, we're seeing additional forms of contradiction spatially. Where do these people go? And with what impact on the wider social, cultural, as well as ecological sustainability of the region? What happens when masses of people are unable to continue to afford in San Francisco and move to sprawling suburbs, which are far less accessible in terms of public transit, and what happens when sprawl takes over the region, what happens both socially and culturally as well as ecologically as a result of this form of market-oriented sustainability that's become dominant in our region. So in thinking about these conundrums, both the power and contradictions and selective embrace of ecotopian imaginaries. Hold on one second. This was explained to me. Here we go. This is because I wanted to be on the internet. So I'm going to this image. We created this project. And the idea here is that there are basically, one of the fundamental ideas is that there are multiple imaginaries that circulate. Utopian dreams look very different depending on who's doing the dreaming. One person's utopia is another person's dystopia. Some utopias are transformed by others. Some become dominant. Some remain marginal. And that we also, that this understanding, this critical analysis should be situated. We need to understand this in relation to particular regions, particular sites in which these different imaginaries come into relationship with one another and often conflict with one another. And so for the last 3 years, I've been working on kind of what this means. What are those sites? What are the different types of sustainability that we might identify that are interacting with one another in our region, together with colleagues and students on this campus at Davis, at Berkeley, University of San Francisco, and other mostly Northern California campuses. And the idea here also, is that there are these different epistemologies of sustainability. So the idea, as has been mentioned, that in order to understand people's visions of the future is necessary to understand how that's informed from their particular pasts, how those ideas are informed through particular histories. And so we came up with these four main, and I'm sorry to have a typology of four, like the political scientists that Andrew Matthews was mentioning, but four main epistemologies of sustainability: eco-oriented sustainability, and the idea here is also that we can identify these different types of sustainability in terms of the types of environment that they believe should be privileged in a sustainable future. What is to be sustained? So what is the type of environment to be sustained? And in an eco-oriented sustainability, it's one that's largely ecological, largely non-human in terms of its understanding of that, although often with some kind of understanding of the interrelationship of the human and the non-human, but one that traces its roots very much to the burgeoning environmental sciences movement and environmental studies movement, also very instrumental in this region and on this campus, as well as to the rise of fields like conservation biology and others. Then we also talk about market-oriented sustainability, and here the environment that's privileged and to be sustained is the environment for capital. And these are, of course, not mutually exclusive and almost always interconnected in various ways, but useful to think about in separation from one another. And here's an image of the Apple II spaceship plopped down on the Carlist Forest in a kind of utopian imaginary of capital in Silicon Valley. Green imaginary. And then, of course, there's justice-oriented sustainabilities that privilege questions of the social environment and accessibility and equity and diversity in that environment. Then there are vernacular sustainabilities or everyday sustainabilities, often informally understood, often not thought of not codified as sustainability, but everyday ways of living and working with nature that have been practiced by indigenous people, that have been practiced in California, that have been practiced by immigrants, and that inform and that people have practiced for multiple generations and hold on to in community gardens, for instance, or in bike transit, that enable them to maintain a living as well as live sustainably with nature. And all of these arguably are influenced by this idea of utopian sustainability. So there's multiple utopias, multiple utopian futures. Okay. So, recognizing this, analyzing how these different utopias interact and compete with one another also enables us to think about forms of displacement that sustainable urban planning can bring about. And the kinds of contradictions and the difficulty that we have in this is often that, we tend to celebrate any kind of form of development that's called sustainable. And so how do we understand the unsustainability of sustainable development? How do we understand the displacements associated with this? And this has been something that has been an increasing part of my research. It connected with a group of scholars, also at NYU, who are doing a project called Democratizing the Green City. And the idea of, and I think there are a number of scholars throughout this country and other parts of the world who are interested in confronting the displacements that this kind of market-oriented green development is bringing about. And this project, Democratizing the Green City, is one that encompasses the Americas. It's largely it's going to be between scholars in Argentina, in Colombia, and in the United States. And in cities like Bogota or Medellin in Colombia, which are considered to be best practice kind of cities for sustainable development that are also experiencing massive waves of displacement of informal settlements in the name of green development. So how do we understand the relationship of ecotopia and displacement has become a big theme in not all of the projects on this site, many of the projects, and much of my own work currently. So one of the classic ways of thinking about this in the critical urban scholarship at the moment is around transit-oriented development. And I'm just going to briefly mention this, and there are people, for instance, Karen Chappell at Berkeley, who's associated with our project, who works on the relationship of what happens when you build transit-oriented development without access to affordable housing. What is the impact in terms of gentrification that new BRT lines, that new transit lines carry with them? And as a result of this, the impact of displacement on the region, the impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, because one of the things that happens when you increase the cost of living and the cost of housing in a neighborhood is that the people who tend to move to that neighborhood tend to drive cars. They tend to use, despite their attraction to the transit-oriented development, to use public transit less. The primary users of public transit are low-income people who are pushed to sprawling suburbs where they do not have access to buses that are of the same, and to public transit networks of the same quality, who have to commute, as Kristen was mentioning, often 2 hours to get to work. And what we're finding in not only the Bay Area, definitely the Bay Area to a greater extent than many other parts of the country, but throughout the country, is that transit-rich neighborhoods, quote unquote, are the least diverse neighborhoods and are also the ones that are creating themselves large greenhouse gas emissions and large carbon footprints because of the sprawl that they're generating through displacement. So that is one of the classic ways of studying this issue. I've also become interested in my recent work on looking at this displacement in terms of one of the themes that was of greatest interest to Ernest Kallenbach, which was recycling. And I'm not going to speak much about it now, but I did want to mention that it's a fascinating case to look at in terms of this relationship. This is the Ecology Action Recycling Center on Commercial Way in Santa Cruz in 1971, and it was one of many recycling centers that were created and that arguably inspired the kind of image of, vision of a recycling-centered world of the novel, and was associated with the passage of bottle bills in California and many other states around the country, as well as a very, in thinking about the Brundtland idea of sustainability being one that's a combination of the, ecology, economy, and equity, one that was one in which many, many people participated. Also, I would argue a kind of vernacular approach to sustainability. So many people made a living and have made a living or supplemented their living by recycling bottles and cans at recycling centers. However, with the rise in San Francisco of recology and new forms of recycling, like curbside recycling that were argued for, many of these recycling centers, despite bottle bills and laws that they should be accessible to people, have been closed. And in San Francisco, in recent years, there have been protests over the closure of some 20 recycling centers, particularly in the northern and most affluent part of the city, with the one of the most influential ones being the Haight-Ashbury Neighborhood Council Recycling Center, which is pictured in the lower left, and much of the issue had to do with gentrification in that area and the idea that property values were going to suffer as a result of the homeless who were bringing their bottles and cans to the center. So I'm interested in thinking about different forms of displacement, direct displacement as a result of eminent domain and the shuttering of these recycling centers, for instance, indirect displacement through gentrification, as well as uneven development that occurs on a larger regional scale as a result of green development in some places and brown or dirty development in other places. One of the impacts of this has been larger amounts of recyclable garbage going into landfills in the outskirts of the city, for instance. And, how am I doing on time? I have to end. Okay, so contradictions and limitations I'll just leave it there. Are we dealing with the role of the, thinking about the role of the ideal or of Ecotopia and how we might be living in a world in which the countercultural ecological ethic can be considered a kind of new spirit of capitalism, to think about a Weberian way of thinking about this, is very much present in much of the findings in this project, as well as the work of historians of our region. At the same time, Frederick Jameson and David Harvey and others remind us to try to think dialectically about the potentiality of new utopian imaginaries. And I think starting with our region is a great idea. It's had an enormous influence on the rest of the world, and no time like the present, and no time like our own home here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to invite the other panelists to come up to the table. I have permission to give everybody a choice. According to the schedule, it's coffee break now, but I think it would be a particular shame not to subject these panelists to question and answer. So if you want to get some coffee or take a little break, just if you could do it quietly, but whoever wants to stay and ask questions, we'll have question and answer now with this panel. We've got our microphones here on the side. Go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question, right here.
So I was struck with the fact that there are so many different ecotopias, and I knew many of these people. The Ecotopia that Chick Callenbach created looked like Chick. It came from his era. Art Crumb's Ecotopia looks like Crumb. There's a disorganization to it. There's a goofiness to it. There's a charged sexuality to it. I think there are people that would hate to live in that Ecotopia. I know the Google people. I look at that Ecotopia that they've created. It looks like them. And I think that there's not just one Ecotopia. I think there are many Ecotopias because we're a diverse species of people, and there's a diversity built into us. Some of us are aggressive, some of us are passive, some of us are family-oriented, some of us are loners, and I think you need something that has the complexity of all of these. And I want to comment on the fact that there was no Latinos in there. There are no Indians in there either. What happened to the reservations? And I'm wondering if I can ask a question. So, what does traditional Latino culture have to offer this Ecotopia? What values would there be if Latinos were present in Chick Callenbach's Ecotopia? How would it have changed it?
What do whites have to offer Utopia?
Well, that's good because we have a short time for question and answer to move along very quickly. Is there another question? Over here.
Thank you. This question goes to Miriam, and the question is really whether or not structural violence is for you a useful term of analysis for these kinds of cases. Structural violence, which then would, I think, carry with it questions about what it means, what it takes to recognize certain kinds of conditions of living and of polluting as violent.
So the question of structural violence, I mean, I think certainly the emphasis on displacement and exclusion and the impacts of that on people's material lives is the place I'm taking a lot of this, and a recognition of moving beyond the post-political framing of many of these utopian scenarios to the very harsh political effects. I think violence is a way of thinking about that. Certainly violence in a multi-species sense makes a lot of sense to me, and as well as in the bodily implications of that, given the environmental justice implications of this. So when we talk about uneven development, we're talking about not only contradictory impacts on the carbon footprint, we're also talking about the displacement of toxins into poorer communities once ecotopias are created in wealthier areas. So there's a violence there. So yes, I think that's a useful framework. Mm-hmm.
We have time for one or two short questions. Anybody else? I think I saw a hand up there.
I was wondering, from a sort of thinking about the kibbutzim perspective, the Jewish utopian idea, and I was very much appreciating, it seems to replicate the idea that the Palestinians were going to be kept out of those utopian sort of socialist villages. But I wanted to ask about if in the kibbutzim there was a contradiction that came in within the institution. There was the problem with what are the children going to do? What is the next generation and the next generation? So here there were parents imagining a utopian sort of village society, but the children growing up didn't, what were they going to do? So I was wondering if the same thing was happening in the sort of utopian Silicon Valley or Palo Alto, where are we imagining the children, the next generation, also going and working in Google? Or do we imagine them doing something that is in contradiction to that?
That's a really interesting question. Well, so I guess, and I think it's a great comparison to the kibbutzim in Israel, and the idea that was raised by Kim Stanley Robinson last night of pocket utopias, and this island quality that so many of the utopias have. And what is one of the things that Harvey talks about well, I think, are the kind of spatio-temporal contradictions of utopian thinking, in terms of the process in which the utopia is created and who's governing and whose vision is dominating that utopia, and then spatially, what kinds of things are offloaded, are externalized once you create a utopia in one particular space. So I think you could argue that there are effects of kibbutzim and there are effects of San Francisco, being these kinds of exclusive and privileged ecological and even quote socialist spaces. So I would say that the region around, the next generation is having to contend with that. Can the next generation afford to live in that space, for instance? Becomes a major question. How do we think about the future, and how do we think about it temporally? How do we think about it spatially? To what degree are you kind of sacrificing the next generation when you create this utopian for the first generation? And sometimes we talk about that in Santa Cruz. Like many of the people in this utopian moment who moved into town and bought these beautiful houses and supported slow growth measures in Santa Cruz are benefiting from that era, but young people can no longer afford to live in Santa Cruz, so this kind of an issue. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay.
All right, Ronnie's saying that's it. You get your coffee break now. Thank you very much. 15 minutes.